In March of 2025, a manufacturer of solar energy technology in Germany has quietly rescinded existing orders. Simultaneously, a defense industry contractor located in Virginia has augmented its strategic stockpile with silver. 3 refining facilities situated in Asia have ceased accepting new contractual agreements. And in London, the foremost and most venerable dealer of precious metals in the world has, for the inaugural time in its 340-year history, imposed restrictions on the quantity of purchases allowed. These events are not hypothetical scenarios for a future date. They are occurring at this very moment. And should you fail to comprehend the implications of these developments, you are poised to witness the most substantial industrial commodity crisis of the 21st century unfold in real time. Over the ensuing 12 minutes, I will delineate the 3-stage containment protocol that has historically preceded every critical resource scarcity. This pattern consists of strategic hoarding, limitations on exports, and the imposition of price ceilings. We observed this phenomenon with crude oil in 1973, with rare earth elements in 2010, with semiconductor chips in 2021, and now it is manifesting with silver. The distinguishing factor this time is the absence of any viable alternative, workaround, or technological innovation to compensate. Once this containment mechanism is fully enacted, entire sectors of industry will grind to a halt. Allow me to illustrate what has already commenced, unnoticed by mainstream media coverage. The initial stage is one of clandestine acquisition. This is the phase where governments and major corporations discreetly amass reserves without public notification. There are no press releases, no induced market apprehension, only a silent, methodical procurement that depletes available supplies surreptitiously. China ceased its reporting of silver import statistics in late 2023. Why is this detail significant? Because when a nation that accounts for 20% of the global silver consumption conspicuously withdraws from statistical transparency, it is not a gesture of openness. It is an act of concealment, masking its acquisition efforts. India's silver imports reached an all-time high for a 38-year period in 2024. This influx was not destined for jewelry production, but rather for its strategic reserves. The Indian government has elevated the classification of precious metals to be on par with military assets. Such a designation is not afforded to a typical industrial commodity. It is reserved for assets considered vital for national security, akin to a weapon. In early 2024, Russia redirected 100% of its domestic silver output to state-held reserves. This metal was neither sold nor exported. It was stockpiled. And here lies a detail that should profoundly concern you. The United States, the very nation that pioneered modern financial systems and dominates global commerce, possesses absolutely no strategic silver reserve. None whatsoever. We divested ourselves of all our holdings between 2005 and 2015, every single ounce. While China, Russia, and India were diligently accumulating, America was selling. Our nation gambled on the robustness of paper markets and the assumption of an inexhaustible supply. Our adversaries, conversely, placed their trust in the tangible control of physical assets. Now consider the behavior of corporations. In 2024, Tesla secured supply agreements for silver extending over 7 years at predetermined price points. They effectively locked in their supply before any potential market constriction. First Solar undertook a similar strategy. Panasonic, LG, and Samsung have all entered into long-term arrangements directly with mining operations, completely bypassing the immediate or spot market. When the world's leading manufacturers begin to hoard essential materials, it is because they have analyzed the data that has eluded public awareness. This is the first phase, acquisition without any outward signs of panic. The astute investors have already positioned themselves. The pertinent question is, have you? The second phase involves the implementation of export restrictions and capital controls. This is the juncture at which nations safeguard their domestic supply by prohibiting exports. Such measures are invariably introduced with justifications. These often include claims of national security, environmental preservation, or the furtherance of industrial policy. The stated reason is ultimately irrelevant. The outcome remains consistent. The supply chain becomes fragmented, global markets fracture, and prices experience drastic dislocations. Let me illustrate how this unfolds. In 2013, Indonesia, the fourth largest producer of tin globally, imposed a ban on tin exports. This was not a perpetual prohibition, but rather a temporary measure intended to stabilize prices. The unspoken translation of this policy was, until we have secured our domestic supply and our strategic allies are adequately provisioned. Following this ban, tin prices experienced a twofold increase. Industries reliant on tin encountered severe shortages. Although the ban persisted for only a few months, its psychological impact was enduring. Nations recognized their capacity to leverage control over vital resources as a geopolitical tool. Consider the rare earth elements crisis of 2010. China controlled 97% of the global supply of these critical materials. Subsequently, they officially restricted exports, citing environmental concerns. The underlying motivation, however, was to secure these elements for their burgeoning electric vehicle, wind turbine, and advanced missile programs. They prioritized domestic needs, thereby curtailing global availability. The prices of rare earth elements escalated tenfold within an 18-month period. Japan engaged in frantic stockpiling efforts. The United States urgently sought to reopen dormant mines, a process that typically requires a decade to yield results. By then, significant damage had already been inflicted. Now observe the unfolding situation with silver. In 2022, Russia prohibited silver exports to countries that had imposed sanctions upon it. In late 2024, Mexico, the world's foremost producer of silver, implemented export quotas. This was not a comprehensive embargo, but rather a selective limitation. It served as a clear signal that supply could no longer be considered a given. Peru tightened its mining regulations, thereby slowing production precisely at a time when demand is experiencing a significant surge. Is this a mere coincidence or a deliberate act of preparation? And the situation darkens further. In February of 2025, 4 banks in South Korea ceased the sale of physical silver. This was not a voluntary decision, but a consequence of their inability to source the metal. When financial institutions possessing virtually unlimited capital and extensive global networks are unable to procure this metal, it signifies that the physical supply has already been significantly depleted. China has restricted its citizens from acquiring precious metals through banking channels. They have elevated the risk classifications associated with such transactions and imposed limitations on participating platforms. The rationale behind this action is straightforward. When the state itself is engaged in large-scale accumulation, it seeks to prevent its populace from competing for the same limited quantities. This constitutes the second phase, fragmentation. Each nation endeavors to secure its domestic supply, leading to the closure of export pathways. The global marketplace, which many had assumed would operate without interruption, begins to falter, and once the second phase is in motion, the advent of the third phase becomes an inevitability. This third phase entails price controls and rationing. This represents the ultimate stage of the crisis. It is a point at which governments and stock exchanges, facing escalating panic, resort to implementing stringent controls, thereby dismantling the illusion of free market operations. The question is not whether this will occur, but when, and the indicators are present, visible to those who are paying attention. Let us revisit the year 1971. President Nixon unilaterally severed the convertibility of the US dollar to gold. Foreign governments were demanding gold in exchange for their dollar holdings, and the United States did not possess sufficient gold reserves to meet these obligations. Consequently, Nixon terminated the gold standard. The price of gold, which had been fixed at $35 per ounce, subsequently surged to $850 by 1980. This was not a mere price adjustment, it was a profound market dislocation. The fiat currency system fractured, and the value of physical gold diverged significantly from its paper representation. Ultimately, those who possessed physical gold emerged victorious. Consider the activities of the Hunt brothers in 1980. They accumulated approximately 200 million ounces of silver and demanded physical delivery. The silver vaults were rapidly depleted, leading to widespread panic in the commodity markets. In response, the rules of engagement were altered. Long positions were prohibited, margin requirements were drastically increased, and trading was temporarily suspended. The Hunt brothers were ultimately defeated. However, the critical takeaway is this: individuals who held physical silver rather than futures contracts or leveraged positions, but simply metal in their possession, ultimately fared well. Although silver's price plummeted from $40 to $10 on paper, physical silver holders who had acquired it at $6 per ounce still realized substantial profits. The enduring lesson here is that when the established system faces existential threats, the rules are often rewritten. However, those in authority cannot confiscate that which they do not control. Let us examine the palladium market in 2001. Russia deliberately delayed its palladium shipments, causing physical supplies to vanish. Futures traders demanded delivery, but there was no metal available. The price of palladium skyrocketed, reaching $1,000 per ounce. Traders holding paper contracts were compelled to accept cash settlements against their will. The exchange effectively forced them to take dollars in lieu of the metal. These dollars could purchase significantly less palladium than their contracts had originally stipulated. Those holding physical palladium amassed considerable fortunes, while paper holders learned a costly lesson about counterparty risk. Now let us turn our attention to the current situation developing with silver. The registered inventories at the COMEX have declined from 100 million ounces in 2020 to under 40 million ounces presently. This represents a 60% depletion. Industrial demand alone consumes 1 billion ounces annually. The total available inventories currently equate to only 3 weeks of consumption. 3 weeks. When the next supply disruption occurs, when a major manufacturer publicly announces its inability to procure silver, the domino effect will commence. Industrial purchasers will enter a state of panic. Governments will move to secure strategic supplies. Investment demand will surge in the paper market, where 100 ounces of paper are traded for every 1 ounce of physical silver. This market is demonstrably unstable. Here is a projection of what Phase 3 will resemble once it is fully implemented. Trading suspensions will become a regular occurrence. The COMEX will suspend silver deliveries. SLV, the largest silver exchange-traded fund, will announce cash settlements due to the unavailability of physical silver. Your shares will no longer represent ownership of silver, but will be converted into dollars, and those dollars will be worth substantially less in terms of silver than when you initially purchased your shares. Governments will implement price controls not for the benefit of the public, but as a mechanism to manage widespread panic. They will artificially cap prices, inadvertently creating black markets where physical silver will trade at multiples of the officially mandated prices. Rationing will commence. Industrial users will be granted priority. Defense contractors, solar panel manufacturers, electronics companies, and retail consumers, your prospects for acquiring silver will be exceedingly grim. Dealers will be entirely sold out. Mints will have backlogs extending for 2 years. Premiums will soar to $100 above the spot price, as the spot price will no longer accurately reflect the market reality. This is not an exercise in fear-mongering. This is an application of pattern recognition, and the discernible pattern is screaming a warning. What makes silver distinct in this particular crisis? Every previous resource crisis has presented an avenue of escape. In the case of oil, Saudi Arabia could increase production. For rare earth elements, other nations could develop their own deposits. With semiconductors, new manufacturing facilities could be constructed. However, with silver, there is no such escape hatch. Allow me to elucidate why. The supply of silver is structurally constrained. 70% of its production is a byproduct of zinc, copper, and lead mining. One cannot simply initiate more silver mining operations. Miners extract base metals with the hope that silver will accompany the yield. The prices for base metals are currently subdued, discouraging investment in new mining endeavors. The development of new mines requires a minimum of 10 years, a time frame that we simply do not have. The current deficit is a present reality. Recycling efforts will not offer a solution. Silver recovery rates from electronic devices are below 20%. The quantities of silver per device are too minuscule, and the extraction process is prohibitively expensive. Furthermore, solar panels sequester silver for 25 years. This is not recycling. It is a removal of silver from the available supply. Substitution is not a feasible option. Copper oxidizes readily. Aluminum lacks the requisite conductivity. It is impossible to engineer a workaround for the fundamental properties defined by the periodic table. Every manufacturer of solar panels has attempted such a substitution, and all have failed. Silver paste remains the sole scalable solution. And here is the critical factor. Demand is mandated by legislative decree. The European Union, China, and the United States have committed trillions of dollars to the global energy transition. To meet established climate targets, solar installations must double by the year 2030. This is not driven by market forces, but by policy imperatives. And policymakers remain steadfast, regardless of whether silver is priced at $30, $60, or $150 per ounce. The mandates will persist, which means that demand is non-negotiable while the available supply is dwindling. The oil crisis of 1973 was resolved. Saudi Arabia increased its output and new fields in the North Sea came online. Demand moderated and the crisis subsided. The silver crisis of 2025 presents a different scenario. There is no equivalent to Saudi Arabia for silver, no vast untapped deposit awaiting development. There will be no moderation of demand, as industries are legally obligated to continue their purchases. This represents the first resource crisis in modern history that lacks a structural solution, necessitating only a drastic price adjustment. And that adjustment is poised to be exceptionally volatile. What this signifies for you personally is not an exhortation to panic, but rather a call to acknowledge the unfolding reality. The containment process has already commenced. Phase 1 is complete, with nations and corporations actively engaged in stockpiling. Phase 2 is currently active, with export restrictions becoming more widespread and the supply chain becoming increasingly fragmented. Phase 3 is imminent. The paper market is operating on borrowed time. It is essential to understand this. Once Phase 3 is fully engaged, the prevailing price of silver will become irrelevant. You will be unable to locate any silver, regardless of its price. Dealers will be completely depleted of inventory. Mints will face wait lists extending for years. Banks will cease their sales of physical silver, and you will find yourself in possession of depreciating currency, unable to convert it into the sole asset that retains its value. The opportune moment for action is now, not next month, and certainly not after the headlines confirm what I am conveying. By that juncture, premiums will likely exceed $50 over the spot price, physical metal will be unobtainable, and the masses will experience widespread panic, forcing you to compete with millions of individuals who have just awakened to the situation. Possessing physical silver in your personal custody, not within an exchange-traded fund, not represented by a certificate, and not stored in another entity's vault, but literally in your hand, is the only secure position. This is a location where no counterparty risk exists, where no government can impose restrictions, and where no exchange can force a cash settlement against your volition. This is the sole strategy that will enable you to navigate Phase 3 successfully. This discourse is not intended as investment counsel. It is analysis based on pattern recognition. I have outlined the 3 phases: clandestine acquisition, the implementation of export restrictions, followed by price controls and rationing. I've provided historical precedents, including oil, rare earth elements, palladium, and gold. And I've explained why silver's situation is fundamentally different: the absence of any substitute, the lack of new supply sources, and the non-existence of an escape hatch. The containment is already underway. Nations are diligently securing their supply chains, and corporations are engaged in aggressive hoarding. The average individual remains entirely unaware of the impending crisis. Do not fall into this category. Do not defer your action until confirmation arrives. By the time the situation is evident to everyone, it will be too late. I urge you to conduct your own verification. Examine COMEX inventory levels. Review export data. Scrutinize corporate supply chain disclosures. All of this information is publicly accessible and meticulously documented. When you observe this pattern, when you witness phase 2 accelerating and phase 3 drawing nearer, you will comprehend that this is not mere speculation. This is the most significant resource lockdown of the contemporary era, and the world is woefully unprepared. Please subscribe and activate notifications, as what follows will determine who has taken preparatory measures and who has not. Those who discern the pattern early do not merely survive, they achieve prosperity. The clock is ticking relentlessly. The lockdown has already begun. The critical question remains: will you act before this limited window of opportunity closes? Do not be like everyone else.